Good afternoon. We're just going to allow a few minutes for folks to enter into the room, and then we will get started, but welcome. Okay, I think it is time to get started. It is 12:02. I think we still have some people trickling in, but that's okay. Although this is me talking. So we're going to get started. I want to welcome you all to the Social Workers Confronting Racial Injustice Conference. We're excited to welcome new participants, as well as those of you that were able to attend our conference in the past. We hope that you got to be a part of last week's sessions, but if you missed those or wish you could see another breakout panel that's happening right now, don't worry. The presentations are all recorded, and our last week's are available on our conference website already, and today's will be in the very near future. So I'm Alice Egan, a clinical faculty member at the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work. I'm so happy you're here for this breakout presentation, Tired of Dancing to Their Song, an assessment of the Indigenous women's reproductive justice funding landscape, with Coya Hat-Artichoker and Zachary Packineau. You'll just have to listen to me for a minute or two, and then I will turn it over to the folks that are the reason we are all here. First, on behalf of the Planning Committee for the Social Workers Confronting Racial Injustice Conference, I ask that you join me in acknowledging that our University of Wisconsin-Madison campus, here on the shores of Lake Mendota, resides within the sacred homeland of the Ho-Chunk people, a place they call Dejo. As the reach of the university extends to the far corners of our state, we also respectfully recognize the inherent sovereignty of the 12 First Nations of Wisconsin. Whether you're watching this from the land of these 12 First Nations or you're more distant, we encourage you to learn about the history of the land that you're on. As social workers, we have a duty to look critically at the role our profession has played in the attempted cultural genocide and destruction of Indigenous families, such as was the aim of boarding schools in this state and across the continent. This conference is rooted in critical reflection on our work as social workers. Our goal is to bring clarity about the past, but also to challenge and inspire us all to move into action in our work in communities once the conference is over. We hope this conference provides space for critical reflection, humility, and openness, allow us to reflect, to hear and tell truths, and move toward action and transformation to support Indigenous rights, cultural equity, and racial equity. With acknowledgement and gratitude, we move forward today in our journey. A few details before we get started. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on our conference website at a later date. We know many of you are curious about the CEUs you registered for, and you are all set. To access this presentation, you are required to provide your name and email, either because you were logged into Zoom or you provided these upon entering. This allows us to verify attendance. You will get CEUs for this presentation, which will be distributed by email in the coming weeks. Your cameras and microphones will remain muted, as will the chat function. But we do have a Q&A feature where you can submit questions for our presenters. Please know that sometimes we don't get to all of the questions, but we're going to work to get to as many as we can. And the presenters have let me know that there will be plenty of time for questions at the end. So if you do ask questions throughout, just know that at the end of the presentation, we will work to get to them. And now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our presenters, Coya Hat-Artichoker and Zachary Packineau. Coya Hat-Artichoker was born and raised on the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota. She is a proud enrolled member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe. Coya has been doing activist work in various communities and movements since the age of 15. She was a founding member of the First Nations Two-Spirit Collective, which works to build a stronger political presence for Two-Spirit people within the National Dialogue of Queer Rights. Coya has worked with a number of philanthropic organizations, including the Astria Foundation, Funding Exchange Out Fund, Headwaters Fund, P Fund, and Bush Foundation. She's a former board member of the American Indian OIC, P Fund, and currently serves as the treasurer of the Sister Song Board. Most recently, she was a community health and health equity program manager at the Center for Prevention at Blue Cross Blue Shield, doing community funding across 3 health initiatives. She or her writing have appeared in After Stonewall, a film, The Advocate, 40 Under 40 LGBT Leaders in the United States for 2010, Sharing Our Stories of Survival, and the Bellerico Project blog, and the Huffington Post. Welcome, Cora. Zachary Packineau is a citizen of the Mandan, Hidasta, and Arikara Nation and is a descendant of the Santa Clara Pueblo. His work spans public service, community organizing, and community health education at the confluence of sexual and reproductive health and rights and LGBTQ+ rights, and centers identities and voices on the axis of race, gender, and class. Our warmest welcome to both of you. We're so looking forward to learning from you today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting us, and thank you for allowing us to attend and share a little bit of what we learned with all of you. Again, my name is Coya White Hat-Artichoker. I am the program officer at the Ms. Foundation for Women. I've been there for about 2.5 years, but as she mentioned, I have been doing activist work for about since the age of 15 across multiple movements. And in particular, a lot of work around reproductive justice and Native women and domestic violence against Native women and general issues of violence around Native women, and work around sexual liberation and decolonization. So we are so super grateful to be here today. Not only, I will introduce Zach a little bit more and talk about his role here, but also we are grateful to be here on behalf of the women that you will see named in this report. Zach and I are the ones who kind of go around and talk about the report, but really we wouldn't be able to do that without the women in this report. A lot of what you're going to hear today is directly their voices. I think we feel very honored to be able to carry their voices into various spaces, to be able to lift up the ways in which they feel the needs around reproductive justice need to be paid attention to within Native communities, and how that ties to sovereignty. And we'll get more into that. So I wanted to also recognize Zach, my co-conspirator, my partner in crime here. Zach and I have known each other for close to a decade now, if not more. We've done work together in various settings. And when we were looking at starting at doing this report, and you should know the report has been funded by the Collaborative for Gender and Reproductive Equity in partnership with the Ms. Foundation. And when I was approached about doing the report and thinking about some of the women who needed to be present and that we needed to talk to, weirdly, I was also one of the people who needed to be in the room. So in order to do the kind of assessment we wanted to do, I needed a partner so that I could also participate at times instead of just facilitating. And when I thought about who I could do that with and who I really love and their analysis, I thought of Zachary. And so I asked him to join me on this journey. And together we designed a facilitation plan and did outreach to these women and held these sessions that culminated in this report. So I just want to say that that is Zach's role, as he is my co-conspirator, my co-lead, and I'm really grateful to him for taking part in this with me and his willingness to go on this journey when, as he often likes to point out in our traditional ways, when we are asked to help or join or do something in a good way, it's always an honor to be able to do that. So I'm honored that he accepted my invitation. So that is Zachary, and I will let him say more about himself as he comes into the room. And I wanted to also just say, you know, the title of the report, Tired of Dancing to Their Song, actually really did come from the women. There was a desire to do, to really create a report and talk about kind of the current state and looking forward, right? So there is mentions of history here, but we don't go into a lot of detail. But I really appreciated that the women really wanted to sort of be assertive in their desire to highlight the urgency and the need. And also, a lot of them have had a lot of experience with philanthropy over the years. And you will see there was definitely moments of frustration as well. So I think it was a very assertive title, and we went with it. So I just wanted to put that out there too. So I'm just going to quickly run down our agenda here to give you an idea of what we're going to be talking about today. So we just are going to go over a little the project background, as well as kind of how we set the stage, the Women's Council, the conversations that we had, the recommendations they came up with, the call to action, the conclusions, and then an acknowledgement. Because one of the things that we often like to say is that we are really the product of multiple people, like our knowledge base. While you see Zach and I here, it is really a community base of knowledge that we're bringing forth. And so we just want to honor that as well. So I wanted to, at that point, I am going to kick it over to Mr. Zachary Packineau. Zachary?
Thank you, Coya, and thank you to the university and the social work department here. I'm very honored to be in this space and honored to have done this project, completed this project, and looking forward with Coya as well. So we're just going to go ahead and get started. We're going to begin first by talking about the financial investments in dollars moved to Indigenous women and girls. Then we're going to move into the broader world of philanthropy and globally on how we arrived at where we are currently. And why we're doing that is we want to put in place the scaffolding for important cultural and historical context of what being Indigenous means in front of these existing crooked edifices of colonialism, both in philanthropy and globally. And later on, we will dig deeper into what the identified funding needs are and what being an Indigenous woman means in the spheres of reproductive justice and sexual and reproductive health and rights. So in 2020, the Ms. Foundation for Women published the Pocket Change Report, a data brief on organizations serving Indigenous women and girls in the United States. What we found was that roughly 9 million, or barely 3% of over $350 million went toward Indigenous women and girls, which does indeed call attention to the historically low levels of philanthropic investments of Indigenous women and girls. The Ms. Foundation understands that Native women have long seen a connection between their tribal sovereignty and their body sovereignty. So the right to make choices about their bodies is deeply rooted in their cultural understanding. And the limits placed on Native women's reproductive choices are directly tied to colonization. Native women have experienced a great deal of freedom prior to the colonization of their traditional lands. And restricting their reproductive freedom is a direct byproduct of colonization and institutional systems that resulted from the loss of land promised and poor quality healthcare. So the voices of Native women are critical to the conversation around reproductive justice, because Native women understand what true sovereignty means to them, and their ability to share that history can only add to the movements across the United States. Coming down to the priorities of funders versus the needs of the communities, foundations and philanthropic partners have shared their funding priorities and have demanded that proposals cater to their own organization's identified priorities. So buzzwords like innovation and resourceful take on different meanings and are defined differently in the cultural context of tribal communities. So what might be considered and funded as innovative in an East Coast or West Coast population hub may not be replicable or even possible in the dominant setting of a dominant rural setting of a tribal nation. Furthermore, access to resources may come in limited supply or not at all. for some tribal communities. So barriers to broadband internet infrastructure, for instance, can sometimes leave significant gaps in a program's ability to reach a wider audience across the large geographic landscape of their tribal community, potentially leaving some community members to go without services and leading to heightened disparities in healthcare, nutrition, and beyond. Some tribal members who may go unsheltered also might have very limited or no access to smartphones, landlines, and transportation. So in recognizing these barriers and in coming back to the notion of innovative, a heavy and increasing emphasis of the reliance on digital rollouts may not always work for some tribal communities. And the impacts of 500 plus years of colonization and colonialism. So Indigenous societies were balanced. Women were always part of the decision-making processes. Indigenous people are communal and have been trying to survive under systems that have demanded and prioritized individualism, selfishness, and competition in ways that were unknown to us, including the introductions of the white supremacist, cisgender, heterosexual patriarchy, and the gender binary. So intricate cultural systems of family and kinship, food and ceremony were eradicated after hundreds of thousands of our ancestors were hunted, killed, and violently looted from our lands and our bodies, including the forced sterilization of Indigenous women. The impacts of colonization continue to reverberate ever so closely with the traumatic legacy of the boarding school era, having only come to an end through policy in 1978 with the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act. That's to say the impacts of trauma do not end simply because a policy has been repealed. So the disparities of limited access to resources that we mentioned exist for a number of reasons, and most importantly, due to the forced removal of Indigenous people from their lands since first contact on Turtle Island, or what has been known as North America. So the goal here is not to minimize the issues our tribal communities face. Rather, it's to be direct about the historical impacts of forced removal, genocide, and land allotment. That is to say, Indigenous people did not arrive at these disparities ourselves. The disparities faced by Indigenous people today are the long-lasting impacts of 500 plus years of colonization, felt by generations upon generations, and brought on by violence through imposed structures of government, capitalism, religion, and blood quantum levels, in which Native people are the only people to have their blood measured. This is a genocidal tactic, and the intent is to make Indigenous people disappear and to complete the American project. Despite the shared experience of historical trauma, what is important to understand about Indigenous communities, and while there are common threads that unify tribal nations, each tribal nation may go about their own ways in carrying out how they care for the land and water, and how their community lives out a value like respect. So that same level of self-determination and body sovereignty, both personal and communal, also arises in identifying the funding needs of Indigenous women-led reproductive justice efforts in Indian country. Our Women's Council, as you can see, they come from many geographic locations, regions, and time zones. We are deeply grateful for this group of Indigenous women leaders for being so generously giving of their time and their decades of knowledge and expertise. And we have benefited from their hearts and their dreams to build toward these historic convenings to identify high priority funding needs of Indigenous women-led reproductive justice. The Women's Council included Sharon Asatoyer of the Comanche Nation, Dr. Peggy Bird of the Kiowa Pueblo, Katrina Cantrell of the Western Shoshone Nation, Stephanie Lozano of the Ho-Chunk Nation, Malia Luarki of the Laguna Pueblo, Tia Oros Peters from the Zuni Pueblo, Dr. Karine Sanchez from the San Ildefonso Pueblo, and Coya White Hat-Artichoker of the Sichangu Lakota Nation. So building the fire. We entered into this space with intention and a good way, reflecting on and answering three big questions. If there were to be a significant investment into Indigenous reproductive justice, where should that funding go? What do we need and how will we get it? And what has the most impact and what would you bet on? So the approach to these convenings can be best articulated through a conceptual framework of looking into and reflecting on the first space or the past, the second space or the present, and the third space where we dream of possibilities. So the primary goal in convening the Women's Council was to create a list of recommendations so as to achieve funding for the current and future Indigenous women-led reproductive justice. It was in the third space where the Women's Council dreamed big of how those funding recommendations could create a lasting impact now and for the next 7 generations. Honoring the next 7 generations is a value shared from the Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy, in which tribal leaders determine how present day decisions will impact their descendants. Nations are taught to respect the world in which they live as they are borrowing it from future generations. So throughout February and March 2021, during the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, our Women's Council wanted to hold these gatherings in a way that felt authentic to them as Indigenous women and as Indigenous women, and in doing so, the meeting space was created by and for Indigenous people only. I want to note that in-person gatherings are held closely by Indigenous people with the ability to see each other face to face and to be together in community, to create meaningful and deep relationships, and most importantly, to share food. So the pandemic created an unknown way of building community together that this group navigated and highlights their outstanding commitment to this effort, and it should be noted as such. However, that closeness was able to be achieved in this virtual space by the shared trust and transparency from each member of the Women's Council. Indigenous people are not defined by historical or individual trauma, and it was essential for this group to sit with each other and lift each other up with tenderness and the sharing of their stories, and to articulate a vision to fund the future of Indigenous reproductive justice. And we highlight this because as Indigenous people, our ability to create community with one another has often equated to our collective survival. So in convening our Sacred Women's Council, we first defined what reproductive justice is, and as defined by the organization's sister song, reproductive justice is the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. We know that abortion access is critical, and women of color and other marginalized women also have often difficulty accessing contraception, comprehensive sex education, STI prevention and care, alternative birth options, adequate prenatal and pregnancy care, domestic violence and sexual assault prevention assistance, adequate wages to support families, and safe homes, and so much more. But for our Indigenous women leaders, this definition of reproductive justice held true, and at the same time necessitated additions that were specific to the cultural values of land, language, traditions, and indigeneity. So while an intersectional lens and framework has contributed to the broad definition of reproductive justice, our Indigenous women leaders talked about intersectionality differently. And they took those intersections and braided them together to acknowledge the full range of reproductive health care specific to and throughout the life cycle of an Indigenous woman's life on the physical plane. Indigenous people consider our hair to be sacred and as a source of power. And the framing of intersectionality as the braiding of the hair allows for them to consider other issues that affect their communities beyond just reproductive justice, but look similar to the ways non-Native feminists name intersectionality. So you can see we have the full definition of reproductive justice, and we've added doula and birth care, miscarriage management, stillborn and grief and death care, fertility treatment, menopause research, land reclamation and water protection, language revitalization, family and community care within multi and intergenerational households, state violence and the abolition of the prison industrial complex, cultural preservation and education, domestic violence and sexual assault prevention, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and historical trauma and resiliency. So all of these intersections are embedded within the sinews of the woven strands in this newly augmented definition of reproductive justice. And these added intersections are inseparable from, and they serve to paint a fuller picture of Indigenous identity and Indigenous women's identity within reproductive justice. So therefore, one intersection or one strand in the braid cannot exist alone and cannot be addressed without the others for the reason that Indigenous women are connected to all life, the land and the water, the ancestors and foremothers, and all sisters, daughters, granddaughters, nieces, mothers, and grandmothers. Furthermore, Indigenous women's reproductive justice encompasses what it means to be a woman and to be a woman in a healthy environment. We understand that what you do to the land, you will do to yourself. And Indigenous women cannot have healthy children when the water is poisoned, and Indigenous women cannot grow families and raise children on land that is decimated. So there's not one Indigenous experience that is indicative of all other Indigenous experiences. Native nations are not a monolith, and this proclamation of this definition underscores, bolds, and highlights this fact. So while Indigenous women hold this truth, we also define the strategies and methods because we know what is measurable and we know what matters to us and to our people. And because of federal removal policies and urbanization, we know why our communities look the way that they do. So it is equally important here to raise that Indigenous communities utilize practice-based evidence to inform activities and interventions because, again, we know it works and we seek to emphasize the intrinsic and holistic knowledge of our communities. So before we can accomplish the full list of recommendations as designed by our Women's Council and told to us, and they're fully outlined in the report's appendix, these 3 steps must be taken first and must be fully supported by community and philanthropic partners. So stage 1 is the critical first step in which the investment must be made in the continued convenings of this group of Indigenous women leaders to lead this work. Many times throughout our time together, we heard that there have not been these kinds of gatherings before, and that support is needed to help lay the groundwork for the movement of Indigenous women's reproductive justice with current leaders and organizations and with many more leaders from tribal nations across the country. In stage 2, Indigenous women leaders will build the reproductive justice field through funding their expansive list of recommendations to continue to pinpoint critical reproductive justice funding needs. So through an ongoing series of regional and national convenings similar to this project, leaders will identify and assert their role in the larger reproductive justice movement and to develop an Indigenous women's reproductive justice funding platform, all facilitated and curated by the Ms. Foundation for Women. Who's readily equipped to co-lead this effort with their experience as a re-grantor. And in stage 3, and finally, the 2 pieces hope to lead to the establishment of a fully realized Native-led reproductive justice organization, which does not currently exist. So the recommendations from the Women's Council highlighted these areas of need, as you can see. The first 3 areas were the most critical. So we as Native nations understand that an ecosystem of survival includes the preservation and protection of land, water, and air as the cornerstone of healthy communities for our people to live in a good way. Indigenous people have walked this land since time immemorial, and our worldview is holistic and interconnected. Capacity building for Indigenous women-led reproductive justice requires more convenings of this kind with current and additional leaders who will affirm the ongoing need for higher dollar, multi-year investments, leading to the creation of a Native-led reproductive justice organization that will partner with existing organizations who are already prioritizing and championing reproductive justice, and to strengthen and train Indigenous leaders and advocates who will center reproductive justice in their communities. Direct service funding needs require more higher dollar multi-year investments to advance Indigenous health equity and to lead to broader representation of Indigenous providers who will be trained in a reproductive justice framework that covers all aspects and the full range of reproductive health care, from abortion care and body sovereignty to birth justice and menopause care and all those strands in between, to better respond to the healthcare needs of our communities. The investment into direct service must include funding that allows for legislative advocacy that will enhance and expand reproductive healthcare access via Indian Health Service, which currently provides a comprehensive health service delivery system for approximately 2.2 million of the nation's estimated 3.7 million American Indians and Alaska Natives. With policy and advocacy, funding commitments require higher dollar multi-year investments, again, to ensure access to legislative vehicles that will drive proactive policy change that impacts and enhances direct service and will help to outline roadmaps for the dissemination of this information for the nearly 60% of Native people who receive care from Indian Health Service. It is critical that both Native patients and providers can access and advocate for all forms of reproductive health care, regardless of living on or off an Indian reservation. These recommendations show that Indigenous people already know what their communities need to thrive, to be healthy, and to live in a good way. Because we already know what works and what is needed, funders and philanthropic partners must demonstrate more than a short-term desire to fund Indigenous women-led reproductive justice. It must be a long-term commitment exceeding 3 years, with reverence for the cultural protocols and an understanding of the unique positions that tribal nations hold in and with their own governments and local and state and federal governments. Because of this unique position, funding needs look different for each Indigenous community, and funding needs for Indigenous communities will look different because of our unique nation-to-nation relationship with the US government. Our call to action. So funders need to understand Indigenous communities by broadening their own understanding of the cultural context and applications of what a funding need like capacity building means to Indigenous communities, and how capacity building is implemented through tribal programs and services. We know what we are talking about, and we know what we need and what our communities need, and funders need to trust our innate understanding. Again, we know what we need, and our funders and philanthropic partners need to be more flexible and more adaptable to our needs and not vice versa. So we are tired of dancing to their song. This is not a transactional relationship for either of us because we need each other. It is beyond time for philanthropic partners to examine their investment portfolios, asking the questions, what have you given to Native-led organizations in the last 3, 5, and 10 years? Multi-year funding without restrictions is imperative because our issues are not annual trends. So the issues in our communities are not 1 year, 2 year, or 3 year commitments. The work to end missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls has been ongoing for decades, although this epidemic is now gaining attention and has entered the national conversation. And despite a burgeoning philanthropic commitment to Native communities by directing funding toward organizations working to expand and protect Native voting rights, the battle has been ongoing for centuries, again, since first contact for citizenship in our own ancestral lands, which was only affirmed in 1924 with the passage of the Snyder Act, and then with full voting rights granted decades later with the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Furthermore, do not pit Native organizations against each other. The remedies or methods to funding Indigenous women-led reproductive justice should not be considered quick or easy because of the distinctiveness of Indigenous people. And the idea to simply throw money at it until it goes away only contributes to Indigenous erasure and philanthropy and leads to more disparities, uncertainty, and this lethal return to find or create innovation in and for tribal communities. Indigenous women-led reproductive justice and all of the braided strands show that funders and philanthropic partners must adapt to needs of Indigenous communities. And in doing so, they must challenge and dismantle their own systems of patriarchy and white supremacy. So there is ongoing work being done at home in tribal nations too. And as we were told, we are sovereign unto ourselves and unto our tribal nations, living out self-determination and body autonomy, both personal and communal, at their most cellular level in our communities. So barriers to obtaining funding for programs can often be steamrolled by patriarchy in tribal communities, particularly in tribal councils and program leadership who often approve proposals before they can even be submitted. What are the conclusions? So currently there is no Indigenous reproductive justice organization led by and for Indigenous women. Indigenous women leaders have been and are piecemealing together what the Indigenous women's reproductive justice movement looks like, because Indigenous women's reproductive justice is often a secondary outcome to the direct service model that is dominant in Indian country. But what if it were the primary focus and not tertiary to the direct service work being provided? The investment of time and resources needs to be made because the investment has not existed to center Indigenous women's reproductive justice. Next, a fully inclusive reproductive justice conversation is always mindful of Indigenous people because we are often left out and are forgotten from conversations. Going forward, every movement will always make space for us at the table. Funders have a responsibility to acknowledge the work of Indigenous women and a shared commitment to dismantling patriarchy. And the opportunity for growth on this frontline issue is immense and helps to create a better and more just world that understands the complexities of the issues and values the solutions of Indigenous women that the Indigenous women bring forward. All of the recommendations outlined by our Women's Council can and will be achieved by our ongoing series of our regional and national convenings of Indigenous women to identify the role of Indigenous women in the larger reproductive justice movement and to develop that reproductive justice funding platform, again, curated and facilitated by the Ms. Foundation. Furthermore, any funding of projects not led by these Indigenous women leaders or their communities would be inauthentic and equates to the historical looting and theft of Indigenous peoples. So Indigenous women have continued to have the doors of philanthropy open, just a sliver, if that were entirely shut together. And now it is time to trust the leadership of Indigenous women. Just like to take some time for some acknowledgements. We are grateful to the individuals and organizations who have contributed to this project and this report. The members of our Women's Council, who are listed again at the top. Trishala Deb from the Collaborative for Gender and Reproductive Equity. Staff from the Ms. Foundation for Women, Tamara Vasson, Roz Lee, Ellen Liu, and Teresa Younger. And additionally, we benefited from the knowledge and contributions of people not named in this report. With that, we're happy to answer questions.
Darn. Okay, here I am. We have a question in the Q&A. Where can I learn more about this topic after the session is over? Any recommendations of readings, videos, or education? As a direct service provider, what can I do to support the call to action?
I think we have provided a link to the report. It's actually pretty lengthy if you're interested. That is also there. And then I guess what I would encourage is to actually do a Google search on some of these women and the work that they've done, because there isn't exactly a Native RJ organization yet. You can look at each of these organizations that they represent. Some of them are affiliated with, most of them are affiliated with organization. And look at the work that they do. So one example would be Tewa Women United. They also, they do a lot of work in their community. Their purpose is not primarily reproductive justice, but they are training a circle of Native doulas as part of their programmatic work. And then, Katrina Cantrell runs a women's health center in Northern California. Native American Community Board, Chair Anassa Toyer. They are located in Lake Andy, South Dakota. Again, their primary purpose is not necessarily reproductive justice. It's a huge chunk of their work, but they began as a domestic violence shelter. So when we talk about kind of the activities that reproductive justice has not been a primary focus, it has often been because there's such an emphasis on crisis intervention in Native communities. So there's always a need to address the more, all of the violence or the things that are happening immediately. And then reproductive justice tends to come after that, because once you get a woman into a shelter, then you start dealing with all of her needs, right? And then that's when you get into reproductive justice and start having those conversations. So I guess I would say that, the report, looking at these women, there isn't a real clear place that I can point to where I say like, this is going to be where you find it. But there are pieces everywhere. So I guess that's where I would start. I don't know, Zach, do you have anything to add?
I would +1 on getting in touch with researching on the Leaders Council as they are, and becoming more familiar with their work.
I have a question while our audience thinks. You mentioned some sort of future directions. What are next steps for the two of you specific to this project?
Sure. And, we have been very fortunate to be supported again by the Center for the Collaborative for Gender and Reproductive Equity. I'm sorry, it's CGRE. And we do this every time. Their name is so complicated. And so then we get it wrong. And then we have to go, I'm sorry, and then start again. Yeah, we've been very lucky to been given some more support by them to continue this process. So at the most immediate next steps, we have built out a timeline. And we are going to attempt to do something that the Ms. Foundation has done before, which is to serve as sort of an incubator for something to kind of spin off. We've done it with networks before. We have a history of doing this. So I think for us, the hope is that we can spend some time in the next year continuing to reconvene the women and to really start to put some, so like I like the idea of scaffolding to really start to, I feel like we've got the foundation and now we're going to start building the house. So I think that for us is the most immediate next step. Our goal overall, the lofty goal, is an RJ organization. We recognize that might be pretty difficult, right? But we're going to wander around and see what we can do. And we also are grateful that, the Collaborative for Gender and Reproductive Equity and the Ms. Foundation are deeply committed to really lifting up the voices of these women in particular, but mostly also like all Indigenous women. And we have a long history as a reproductive justice funder. So this is very much in our wheelhouse. And it's very much something that I think, so the women who are involved in are very excited. Their excitement is really palpable. And so we're looking forward to seeing what happens when you harness that amount of energy, because each of them is they're all their own powerhouses solo. So I'm curious to see what happens when we get them all going in the same direction. So I'm excited about that. That's our immediate next steps. Did you want to add anything, Zach?
I think I would add, just a further emphasis on the excitement and the commitment to our Women's Council leaders. They're ready to get back to work and to build this movement together. So.
We have another question, and this question is sort of specific to Madison, but we could generalize it to your geographical regions too. But the participant asks, the last breakout session that they attended had somebody from Harambee Village. And part of what Harambee does is provide birth doulas. Is there any connection between this project and birth doulas?
I mean, I think that that is part of this. I mean, it's in the same umbrella, right? And a lot of the women who, like, I referenced Tewa Women United, right? So Korean, like starting a doula, an Indigenous doula program, right? So she's bringing that base of knowledge to this effort, right? And there are other ones who, are who identify as doulas within the group. and even amongst some of our funders, right? So I think what we're trying to do is create sort of an umbrella organization. I think the closest example that I could provide might be if you're familiar with Sister Song, which is a women of color reproductive justice collective out of Atlanta, Georgia. And Sister Song really sees themselves as kind of an umbrella organization to a lot of different reproductive justice efforts, including doulas and including like aftercare for mothers and mothering groups. So I think we're looking to take sort of a multifaceted intersectional feminist lens within, you know, rooted in indigeneity around what we create, right? Because I think as we said in the report, how we view reproductive justice as Native people, as Indigenous people, is often much more expansive than it's currently defined, even within the current reproductive justice movement, which often gets hijacked a lot by abortion, right? Which is rightfully so. That is under attack. But how do you create a spectrum of kind of what reproductive justice means and where do you work? So I think we're going for that. So doula will definitely be part of it, but it will be a component of it.
Okay, we have a question here. And this has some similarities to the last question. I would love to hear more about the history of midwifery and or full spectrum doula birthwork in Native communities. What are the key barriers, i.e. perhaps access to credentials, that full spectrum doulas and midwives in the Native American community experience as they work towards reproductive justice?
That's a really great question. And I have to say, it's not one that I'm familiar with, because I am not a doula. I am a convener and a writer sometimes. And, I'm really, honestly, I'm a philanthropist. Like I work in philanthropy. But I haven't, a lot of the work that I have done around reproductive justice has really been rooted in kind of the colonial framework and the history of how we sort of got here. But I'm not an active doula, and I'm not aware of those barriers. But I would point you again back to Taylor Women United, and also what is Malia's organization? Zach?
Indigenous Women Rising.
Indigenous Women Rising. They are, I think they do doula care as well, but they're also an abortion fund in the Southwest.
So, Coya, I was noticing that your participation in this is at multiple levels. So you were, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were on the Women's Council, but then have also been involved sort of at higher levels in terms of writing the report and things. What was it like to participate in the Women's Council piece?
It's a fine balance. Like, I think that one of the things that is true, the reason I know all these women is because we did activist work together. And to bring them into the room was great. I think it was hard because also, to your point, multiple roles. And so just trying to be really respectful, but it was, I think there was a moment, where it was really, I think if you talk to any of the women, they will tell you that like, this just hasn't been done before. We have known each other in spaces that were created by other people. So like we might see one of each other at something, at an event. Like I always see Corinne somewhere, or I'll see Katrina somewhere. We never saw all of us together in one place. We've never done that. And so I think that was really exciting. That was actually probably the most exciting aspect of it, was that I know that all of us were aware of each other, or we have all crossed paths at some point. And again, when you look at the sort of spread of the women, each one is doing something around reproductive justice in a very different kind of way. So I think for us, there was just a level of excitement and a lot of respect. I will say that. And it was also just really, it was really thrilling for me, like to be able to help to convene that kind of space. And we remain grateful to the collaborative for really reaching out. The person who works there with us has a long history of doing work in Indigenous communities. And when, this was something that she also thought a lot about, was kind of the lack of investment in Indigenous communities around reproductive justice. So it was really her reaching out and saying, hey, like, I know you do this work and now you're at Ms. and what if we did something together? And I have to say, it actually, I mean, I think there are definitely times when I have to remind myself that I need to learn how to dream bigger, because being able to be in that room with those women was something I could not have dreamed of 3 years ago. So it really is exciting to us, and it's really new, and we feel like it's pretty unprecedented. So it was pretty thrilling. Zach, did you want to add anything?
Nothing from me, thanks.
He's being shy.
A comment / question here from the audience. So this type of movement is needed and will be a large undertaking. I'm glad there's a group of women taking on this task and looking to support Indigenous women going forward. With the complexity of what would be housed under the reproductive justice landscape, what areas do you think would be or should be focused on first? Have you noticed any changes in any of the reproductive justice areas in the recent years?
Well, I think we highlighted, when you look at the report, there were actually, like, what Zach highlighted was like the capacity building, those 3 main things. There were 3 other things that they mentioned. So there are actually 6 issue areas. We prioritized them based on what they said. So those top 3 were pretty much what they identified as being the priorities. I think that they're currently really just interested in sort of getting something going, right? And I think that is the bigger priority. I mentioned like that everything gets hijacked by abortion, right? And with the recent case in Texas and with the Mississippi case, access to abortion is becoming exceptionally limited. But one of the things that we talk about a lot is that, like, for a lot of people who are seeing what's happening and seeing this sort of kind of closing circle around access, for Native women, it's been like that the whole time. It has always been that way because of the Hyde Amendment. Like, you can't use federal dollars to provide abortion services, which, when we talk about Indian health service, most Native people who are not living in an urban center are accessing their health care through IHS, which means that it's basically, there's just no access to reproductive care, like abortion, basically, on the reservation, because federal dollars cannot be used for it. So we have felt like Texas for a long time. But I think to the question of what do we see happening, I think that's the kind of bigger piece is, we're watching what's happening across the country, knowing that, like, what that's going to look like. So I feel like it's kind of like the concept of universal design, right? That, like, if we can do something that gives Native women more access and more of a voice and more sovereignty, that will lift all other groups of women up, because Native women are some of the most marginalized in the United States. So to the concept of, like, if you can lifts all boats, right? I'm sorry, I'm kind of talking in circles, but I think you get what I'm trying to say. We can make an impact with Native women. We'll make an impact for all women. It will just trickle up. Not to get into Reaganomics, sorry.
Zach, did you have anything to add to that one?
Yeah, I think I would add, in the report, excuse me, the full list of topical, recommendations are named, and I'm just pulling those up again for myself. We have policy and advocacy, direct service, capacity building. We also had education. One second here. Prevention and health and well-being. So there are 6 buckets of funding needs that were identified with our women's circle, and so it was just so that it just happened that capacity building, policy and advocacy, and direct service really had the highest number of recommendations underneath those areas. But all 6 of those areas were identified as immediate areas of need.
Okay, another question. Sorry, I'm looking in a couple of different spots here. Do you have any reflections on how you centered Indigenous ways of knowing and methods of inquiry in your facilitation of these conversations and the writing of this report? Your use of braided hair as a metaphor for intersectionality and as a parallel for this work was really powerful.
How we center Indigenous ways of knowing. Is that correct? Yeah. I'm gonna I think that I guess the obvious answer to me is that we're Indigenous. That Zach and I are both Indigenous. And I think that we, it felt really important to us to really kind of create a space, the kind of space we created, when we started with the women, we opened every session with a prayer. We opened every session with an acknowledgement. And, in Indigenous societies, we often asked our elders to pray first, and really to situate ourselves in kind of what we have talked about, which is, what is our obligation to our people and what can we do for them, given the opportunity? And how do we do it in a way that really is true to who we are as Indigenous people? And so I think that, part of what that meant was we did keep it all Indigenous. We did not invite anybody in that room who wasn't Indigenous. And we helped to build a sense of safety with each other and community knowing. And people, I think, really built a sense of trust with each other. And what I really appreciated about it the most, and I will also let Zach offer any reflections though, was that, there was a real shared commitment to them because they each represent an organization or were somehow affiliated or tied to one. There was a real desire in that room to not be in competition with each other. And I think that is always really hard when you are, when money isn't involved. In philanthropy, we talk about money and power a lot. And I think that it takes a lot to really put forth the idea of the community first before what you can get from a certain thing. And I think that is actually very Indigenous. I think that the very essence of who all of these women were, even the title to the report, the page of the report, that was some of the drawings inside the report, those were created by those women while we were in those discussions. So I feel like, that was kind of the way that we uplifted Indigenous ways of knowing. And the ways that in this report, I think we say time and time again that it's important to listen to these women, because I think in just what we know at the Ms. Foundation is that like there has historically been a lack of investment in the leadership of women and girls of color. And that is like really amplified when it comes to Native community. So I think one of the big things for us in this thing is like really uplifting the knowledge of Indigenous women and really uplifting that we come to this conversation in a very different way. And what we hope for and how we will accomplish it is going to look very different. We will operate within the structures that are put before us, but the way that we're going to hold it and hold each other is going to look very different. So I would say that. Zach?
Yeah, thanks, Coya. I think I'll speak to sort of the methods of inquiry and facilitation of these conversations and in writing the report. So, you know, Coya mentioned much earlier in our time together that Indigenous culture and tradition really often allows for someone to be invited into a shared sacred space, and that invitation is always considered an honor. So when we are invited into that shared sacred space, we must approach both the invitation and that space with you know, utmost respect and intention, as an opportunity to learn and to grow individually and collectively. So while I was there to ask questions, you know, I was also learning more about, you know, how do I support Indigenous women-led reproductive justice here. And our sovereignty and liberation as Indigenous people is interconnected, and it's dependent on each other. So, you know, we've been working in and under systems of oppression that were forcibly imposed upon us, you know, especially the white supremacist, cisgender, heterosexual patriarchy and the gender binary. And especially because of that, it demonizes those of us who are Indigenous and identify as Two-Spirit and LGBTQ+. So when we work together, you know, we are demolishing those structures that continue to pit us against each other.
Thank you. Any more questions from the audience? I'm looking at the Q&A here. Zach and Coya, anything that you were hoping folks would ask about or that was left unsaid?
Nothing from me. Thank you. Thanks for the time and allowing us to have this space with each other.
Yeah, I don't think there was anything missing. So thank you.
Well, thank you both so much for sharing your time and your expertise and all of this valuable information with us today. Hopefully folks noticed that I put the report in a response to one of the questions, and so people can access that. Thank you to everyone in attendance for being part of this event and your commitments and efforts to confront racial injustice. Please be sure to fill out the evaluation. That link was also provided, and you'll be emailed later today with the link too. And as we mentioned in the beginning, those of you who requested CEUs, when you registered, will receive those in email. At 2 p.m., so we have a little bit of time, at 2 p.m. we'll have our closing session of the conference, a conversation between Oceana Sawyer and Ali Modro. We hope you can make that, and that link was also provided in the Q&A. So thank you, everyone, and thank you again to our presenters. It was great to meet you both.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again.